On April 6, 1945, a ship set sail from the Japanese port of Kure, the likes of which had never existed before and has not been seen since. 72,000 tons of steel, 9 guns of monstrous caliber, armor as thick as half a human's height, and a crew of 3,000 men, every one of whom knew he would never return home. There was exactly enough fuel on board for a one-way trip. There was no way back. The battleship Yamato, the largest and most powerful combat vessel in all of human history, was heading out on its final mission to single-handedly take on the entire American fleet off the shores of Okinawa. But how did it happen that a ship capable of erasing a small city with a single salvo did not sink a single enemy vessel during its entire service? To understand this, one must go back 40 years to an era when the Japanese Empire was just beginning to dream of dominance in the Pacific Ocean. In May 1905, a battle took place in the Tsushima Strait that overturned Japan's entire naval strategy for decades to come. A Russian squadron, having made an incredible journey from the Baltic Sea across 3 oceans, met the Japanese fleet of Admiral Togo. The battle lasted less than 24 hours, and the Japanese won a crushing victory. For the young island empire, this became proof of a simple and alluring idea. One grand naval battle can decide the outcome of an entire war. Japanese admirals called this doctrine Kantai Kessen, which meant the decisive battle doctrine. Its essence was simple to the point of madness. One must build ships so massive and powerful that in a general engagement they could destroy any opponent in a single day. It was during these years on the other side of the globe that an event occurred which added fuel to the fire of Japanese ambitions. In 1906, Great Britain launched the battleship Dreadnought, which instantly made all existing combat ships in the world obsolete. Its powerful armament, thick armor, and steam turbines set a completely new standard for naval warfare. Japanese engineers and admirals closely studied the British experience, and in 1909, the Empire laid down its first new-type battleships. Year after year, they became larger and more fearsome, and by 1920, Japan launched the battleship Nagato, armed with 8 guns of over 400mm caliber, making it the most powerful warship on the planet at that time. The Japanese Empire was rapidly gaining strength, and Washington understood this perfectly. That is why, after the First World War, Western powers imposed a series of humiliating agreements on Japan. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 set a strict ceiling for Japan. Its fleet could not exceed 60% of the size of the American one. For a proud nation that had just proven its military might to the world, this was a slap in the face. Japanese diplomats demanded equal status with Great Britain and the United States, but their petitions were rejected time and again. The West saw Japan as a junior partner, but by no means an equal player. For a decade and a half, Japan endured these restrictions, gritting its teeth and building up what the treaty did not directly forbid. But in 1934, patience snapped. The empire withdrew from the League of Nations, rejected the Washington Treaty, and announced it no longer intended to obey others' rules. Now the hands of the Japanese admirals were untied, and they immediately began implementing a plan they had been harboring for years. The Imperial Navy intended to build 4 super battleships, so gigantic and powerful that each of them could single-handedly withstand several enemy ships simultaneously. The logic was simple and ruthless. Japanese strategists understood perfectly that their country could never match America in terms of industrial production volume. American factories could churn out ships by the dozens, while Japanese shipyards worked at their limit even when building a few large vessels. Therefore, the bet was placed on quality over quantity. Each super battleship was to carry 18-inch guns, the largest ever installed on a ship, and be protected by armor capable of withstanding the impact of shells of the same caliber. One such ship, according to the designer's plan, was to be worth an entire enemy squadron. Imperial Navy engineers went through more than 24 different projects before settling on the final version. The future battleship was to carry 9 guns of 460mm caliber, have underwater armor capable of withstanding a torpedo strike weighing 300 kilograms, and possess a displacement of no less than 70,000 tons. The world had never seen anything like it. In 1936, construction was officially approved, and the Japanese military machine began to bring to life the most ambitious and secret shipbuilding project in history. Building such a monster required not only engineering genius, but also an unprecedented level of secrecy. The Japanese command realized that if American intelligence learned about the super battleships, Washington would immediately launch its own program to build even more powerful ships, and then the entire plan would lose its meaning. Therefore, the project was classified so thoroughly that even most Imperial Navy officers had not the slightest idea of what was happening at the Kure and Nagasaki shipyards. The shipyard in Kure, where the lead ship of the series was laid down, had to be rebuilt practically from scratch. Existing docks simply could not accommodate a hull of such dimensions. Japanese engineers expanded the dry dock, deepened its bottom by nearly 1 meter, and installed cranes of unheard-of lifting capacity to lift massive sections of armor and gun turrets. But the most striking precautionary measure was the camouflage. High barriers made of sisal fiber and woven mats were erected around the entire shipyard, blocking the view from all sides. Additional buildings and warehouses were constructed next to the dock with the sole purpose of hiding the true scale of the ship under construction from prying eyes, and even more importantly, from the lenses of potential spies' cameras. At the Mitsubishi shipyard in Nagasaki, where the sister ship Musashi was being built simultaneously, security measures were even stricter. Workers were forbidden from discussing their activities even with family members. All blueprints were kept in special safes and issued strictly by name with a mandatory signature. Photographs of all workers were placed in special albums and compared with everyone entering or leaving the shipyard territory. Work was organized in such a way that no single engineer could obtain a full set of blueprints and specifications, seeing only their own small part of the project. The level of paranoia reached the point where even some components of the ship were produced at different factories across the country, and the workers at each of them had no idea what exactly the part they were manufacturing was intended for. On November 4th, 1937, the keel of the ship under the code name Object Number 1 was laid at the Kure shipyard. Construction proceeded at a rapid pace, but with incredible thoroughness. The hull was assembled from steel plates of a special composition developed specifically for this project. Armor plates underwent multi-stage quality control, and even the slightest defect meant the rejection of an entire batch. Every element of the construction was calculated with a margin of safety never before built into any warship in the world. Simultaneously, main-caliber guns were being cast at weapons factories. Each barrel was over 21 meters long and weighed almost 130 tons. The shells for these monstrous cannons weighed 1,460 kilograms each, and the firing range reached 42 kilometers. This meant that the Yamato could rain deadly fire down on an opponent long before they could get within range for a return shot. In theory, no existing ship could survive the impact of these shells with its armor, nor could it respond from such a distance. Imperial Navy engineers were convinced they were creating a weapon that would simply have no equal on the ocean expanses. August 8, 1939, was the day thousands of people who had dedicated several years of their lives to this project had been waiting for. The Yamato was launched under conditions of the strictest secrecy. No grand ceremonies, no newspaper reports, no cheering crowds on the embankment. The largest ship on Earth slid into the water almost silently, as if it did not exist. Even the fact of the launch was classified, and the world would not know for many years that a true naval leviathan had been born in the quiet bay of Kure. After the launch, a long and painstaking process of fitting out and equipping began. Workers mounted the gun turrets, each of which weighed as much as a large destroyer. They installed fire control systems, laid kilometers of electrical cables and pipelines inside the giant hull. Work proceeded in parallel on the anti-torpedo protection system, which, however, later proved to be insufficiently developed and became one of the construction's weak points. By this time, it was decided to rebuild the third ship of the series, the Shinano, into an aircraft carrier. The war in the Pacific had not yet begun, but the Japanese command was already starting to realize that the future of naval battles might belong not to giant guns, but to carrier-based aviation. However, this realization came too late and too slowly to change the fate of the Yamato. The battleship continued to be completed specifically as a battleship, with all resources and hopes invested in it that one decisive battle could turn the tide of the war. On December 16, 1941, just 9 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Yamato was officially commissioned into the Imperial Navy. However, the ship was declared combat-ready only in May 1942, after the completion of intensive crew training and exercises. 12 boilers and 4 steam turbines propelled this mountain of steel to 27.5 knots. At an economical speed, the cruising range was over 7,000 nautical miles. The Yamato became the flagship of the combined fleet under the command of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the very man who planned the attack on Pearl Harbor. But Yamamoto himself had an extremely conflicted attitude toward his new flagship. The admiral had spent considerable time in America, knew the power of American industry perfectly well, and in his heart understood that the era of battleships was coming to an end. But the machine had already been started, the money spent, and now the most powerful ship on the planet had to prove it was worth every yen invested in it. The irony was that the most expensive and most fearsome warship in history spent the first months of its service as a floating headquarters. Admiral Yamamoto placed his command post on board the Yamato, and while thousands of Japanese sailors were dying in bloody battles across the Pacific, the super battleship stood deep in the rear, swaying at anchor in safe waters. Officers on other ships of the fleet bitterly nicknamed the Yamato the Floating Hotel because its crew lived in conditions unthinkable for the rest of the fleet. There were more than 3 square meters of living space for each crew member, which was unheard of luxury by Japanese standards, where sailors on destroyers were crowded into 1 square meter. There were air conditioners, refrigerators for storing fresh food, and even its own bakery on board, which baked fresh bread for the crew every morning. In June 1942, the Yamato went to sea as part of the fleet's main forces during the operation at Midway Atoll. This was supposed to be the very decisive battle it was built for. The Japanese plan called for the destruction of the remaining American aircraft carriers and the capture of the strategically important atoll, which would open the way for further expansion. Yamamoto personally directed the operation from the bridge of his super battleship, but he was 300 miles behind the carrier strike forces. The Battle of Midway turned into a catastrophe, but not for the Americans. In a matter of minutes, dive bombers from the carriers Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet turned 4 Japanese aircraft carriers into burning ruins. The Yamato did not fire a single shot during the entire battle. The most powerful ship on the planet turned out to be a useless spectator to the greatest naval defeat its own country had ever experienced. After Midway, the Yamato relocated to Truk Island, where it spent about a year continuing to fulfill the role of the combined fleet's floating headquarters. It became obvious that the ocean war was being won by aircraft carriers and carrier-based aviation, not by armored giants with heavy guns. However, the Japanese command stubbornly refused to acknowledge this fact. The fuel crisis, growing in Japan month by month, made every sortie of the super battleship into the sea an extravagant luxury. Its voracious boilers burned huge amounts of fuel oil, and the Empire's oil reserves were rapidly melting under the strikes of American submarines, which ruthlessly sank Japanese tankers one after another. On December 25, 1943, while north of Truk Island, the Yamato received combat damage for the first time, not in an artillery duel, but from a torpedo from the American submarine Skate. The explosion ripped through the underwater part of the hull on the starboard side near the aft main battery turret, and the battleship took on about 3,000 tons of seawater. The powder magazine of the aft turret was flooded, and the ship's combat capability was seriously affected. The Yamato had to head to Japan for repairs. From January to April 1944, it stood in a dry dock at the Kure shipyard, where engineers patched holes in the side armor and hull structures. Only in October 1944 did the super battleship finally get a chance to engage in a real fight. American troops began landing in the Philippines, and the Japanese command threw practically all remaining fleet forces into battle. This was the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle of the Second World War, involving hundreds of ships on both sides. The Yamato was part of the Central Strike Group under the command of Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita. 5 battleships, 10 heavy and 2 light cruisers, and 15 destroyers moved in his formation. The plan was bold. While Japanese aircraft carriers distracted the main forces of the American fleet to the north, Kurita's group was to break through the San Bernardino Strait and fall upon the practically defenseless American transports and landing ships off the coast of Leyte. Already on the approach to the strait, everything went off plan. American submarines spotted the Japanese squadron and attacked it, sinking 2 heavy cruisers. Then carrier-based aviation struck, and wave after wave, American planes rained bombs and torpedoes on the Japanese ships. It was in these attacks that the Yamato's sister ship, the battleship Musashi, was lost. It was hit by 20 torpedoes and 17 bombs before it capsized and went to the bottom, taking more than 1,000 crew members with it. The Yamato itself was also struck by 3 aerial bombs in the bow section near the first main battery turret. Despite the losses, Kurita still led the remnants of his squadron through the San Bernardino Strait, and at dawn on October 25th, encountered American ships off Samar Island. This was the only time during the entire war that the Yamato's guns opened fire on enemy ships. At 6:58 in the morning, its giant barrels spoke from a distance of 27 kilometers. The first salvos were aimed at the escort carrier White Plains. The Yamato's gunners believed they had achieved hits, but the opponents turned out to be not battleships or heavy cruisers, but a group of 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 escort destroyers. The American sailors showed incredible bravery and charged into the attack, setting up smoke screens and launching torpedoes. The Yamato was forced to evade torpedo attacks, making sharp maneuvers that led it further and further away from the enemy. Kurita, having lost contact with headquarters and lacking a clear overall picture of the battle, decided to retreat, delivering a crushing blow to the very idea of the invincible super battleship. After retreating from Samar, the Yamato returned to the port of Kure, where it underwent repairs. The 3 bomb hits had not caused critical damage, but the crew's morale was undermined much more seriously than the steel plating. The sailors had seen with their own eyes how the Musashi perished and understood that air superiority was irrevocably lost. Without its own air cover, even the most armored ship on the planet turned into a huge, slow target for hundreds of enemy planes. From November 1944 to March 1945, the Yamato stood at the pier in Kure. During these months, engineers did not just patch the damage received, but also conducted a serious modernization of the anti-aircraft armament. The command finally realized that the main threat came from the sky, and the number of 25mm anti-aircraft guns on board was increased to 152 barrels in triple mounts. Additionally, the number of twin 127mm anti-aircraft guns was doubled. The ship bristled with anti-aircraft guns, but even this measure was a drop in the ocean compared to the armadas of American carrier-based aircraft, which by that time ruled the Pacific Ocean without question. While the Yamato was being repaired, the war came to the doorstep of Japan itself. On April 1, 1945, American troops began landing on Okinawa, the last major island on the way to the Japanese archipelago. The loss of Okinawa would mean that enemy bombers and ships would gain a base in immediate proximity to the empire's main islands. The Japanese garrison on Okinawa resisted desperately, but without support from sea and air, its days were numbered. It was then that a plan was born in the depths of the Japanese headquarters, desperate and insane even by the standards of a country that was already using kamikaze pilots extensively. The operation was named Tengo. Its essence was extremely simple and extremely cruel. The Yamato, accompanied by a small escort consisting of the light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers, was to break through to Okinawa at full speed, beach itself on the coast, and turn into an unsinkable shore battery. Its monstrous guns would rain fire on American positions, supporting the Japanese garrison until the last shell left the barrels and the last crew member fell at his post. It was also expected that this raid would distract the enemy's carrier-based aviation and facilitate the massive kamikaze attacks on American landing vessels off the coast of Okinawa scheduled for April 7th. Any sailors who survived this were to go ashore and fight as infantry. When the plan was brought to the Naval Command, even seasoned admirals could not hide their shock. Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito, who was to lead the operation, initially categorically refused to lead men to certain death. He stated directly that it was a senseless waste of human lives and the last combat ships. But pressure from above proved too strong. The main argument was simultaneously cynical and absurd. If thousands of young kamikaze pilots sacrifice themselves every day, then the sailors of the Imperial Navy have no moral right to sit in port. Ito eventually complied, realizing that arguing was useless. Fuel for the return trip was not provided. Exactly enough fuel oil was loaded onto the ships to reach Okinawa. However, according to some accounts, port workers in Kure, at their own risk, pumped slightly more than the allotted amount into the Yamato's tanks, hoping to give the crew at least a phantom chance of return. Whether this was so or not no longer mattered, because everyone on board understood the road led only one way. On the evening of April 5th, a farewell dinner was held on board the Yamato. The crew was issued stocks of sake, which were usually kept for solemn occasions. The sailors drank, sang old songs, and wrote their last letters home. Many of them were very young, barely 20 years old, drafted into the Navy in the final months of the war, and having not even properly learned how to handle their battle stations. Officers went through the compartments, shaking subordinates' hands and speaking short words of gratitude for their service. No one harbored illusions, and everyone realized they were spending their last night in this world. On the morning of April 6, 1945, the Yamato weighed anchor and left the port of Kure, heading toward Okinawa. The cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers went with it, a pathetic escort for a ship that was to challenge the largest fleet in history. There was no air cover at all, as the remaining Japanese planes were reserved for kamikaze attacks and could not be allocated for the protection of surface ships. The Yamato sailed exposed, without a single fighter overhead, relying only on its armor and anti-aircraft guns. No, the Americans already knew about the sortie of the Japanese squadron. Even before the Yamato cleared coastal waters, American submarines spotted it and transmitted the coordinates to the Pacific Fleet Command. On the decks of the aircraft carriers, hundreds of planes began warming their engines, and the hunt for Japan's last super battleship was on. The morning of April 7th turned out to be overcast. Low clouds hung over the East China Sea, and Japanese sailors silently peered into the gray sky, knowing that it was from there that their death would come. The Yamato moved at a speed of 22 knots surrounded by its tiny escort, and on the bridge, Vice Admiral Ito maintained a somber silence. Okinawa was still more than 24 hours away, but they were not destined to get there. Early in the morning, American reconnaissance planes discovered the Japanese formation and recorded the squadron's exact position and course. The Yamato's radar detected multiple aerial targets approaching from the south, and the call to battle stations rang out through the ship. Sailors rushed to the anti-aircraft guns. Loaders took their places at the ammunition elevators, and in the medical compartments, doctors laid out surgical instruments, preparing for the flow of wounded. Starting from noon, the first wave of American planes emerged from the clouds. 227 aircraft, launched from the decks of the carriers of Task Force 58, fell upon the Japanese squadron simultaneously from several directions. Torpedo bombers flew at a low level over the very waves, while dive bombers came from above, and the Yamato found itself in the deadly grip of a coordinated attack. All anti-aircraft guns opened a frantic barrage, and the sky around the ship was covered with hundreds of black puffs from shell bursts. The first torpedo hit the port side, and the ship's hull shuddered from the dull underwater impact. Within seconds, another torpedo slammed into the same side, and water began to pour into the sealed compartments. Almost simultaneously, a bomb pierced the upper deck in the stern area, and a fire broke out on the quarterdeck. Damage control parties rushed to extinguish the flames and patch the holes, but the attack did not stop for a second, and every few minutes, new explosions rocked the wounded hull. American pilots had received orders to attack the Yamato only from one side. All torpedoes were deliberately slammed into the port side to increase the list and prevent the crew from restoring balance by counter-flooding starboard compartments. This was a cold-blooded and methodical tactic designed to capsize the giant on its side. The Yamato's crew fought desperately for survival, flooding the starboard compartments to level the list. Now, with every new torpedo, more water entered, and the ship's speed steadily dropped. Part of the anti-aircraft guns failed one by one. Their crews were killed by bomb fragments or swept away by the blast wave. The deck was littered with the bodies of the dead and fragments of twisted metal. And in the lower compartments, sailors waist-deep in water continued to fight the flooding, sealing one bulkhead after another. There were so many wounded that the medical service could no longer cope, and the corridors turned into a semblance of field hospitals where people lay directly on the steel floor. The second massive wave of attack hit the Yamato, and this time the Americans acted even more cohesively. Torpedo bombers came in so low that their wheels nearly touched the crests of the waves and dropped their deadly cargo almost at point-blank range. New torpedoes, one after another, hit the port side, and the ship shuddered as if a volcano had erupted inside it. The list increased sharply, and the ship's commander, Captain Kosaku Aruga, ordered the flooding of the remaining starboard engine rooms, sacrificing speed for the sake of saving the ship from capsizing. This helped for only a few minutes. After 2 hours of continuous combat, the Yamato had received up to 10 torpedo hits and 13 direct hits from aerial bombs. The steering gear failed, and the battleship lost the ability to maneuver, beginning to describe a helpless circle, having turned into a stationary target. Vice Admiral Ito heard the report on the damage, after which he ordered everyone still capable of moving to leave the ship. The Admiral himself locked himself in his cabin and remained on board. At 14:23 local time on April 7, 1945, what every sailor on board feared happened. Because of the heavy list, the huge 460mm shells in the forward main battery magazine shifted from their storage places. A moment later, a monstrous explosion occurred, visible from a distance of dozens of kilometers. The detonation of the ammunition generated a pillar of flame and smoke that rose to a height of over 6 kilometers, and sailors on American ships far beyond the horizon saw this mushroom-shaped column with the naked eye. 72,000 tons of steel, which took years of labor by thousands of people to build, disappeared under the waves of the East China Sea in a matter of minutes. Of more than 3,000 crew members, only 269 survived. 3,063 sailors perished along with their ship. Along with the Yamato, the cruiser Yahagi and 4 of the 8 destroyers went to the bottom. The Americans lost 10 aircraft and 12 pilots in this battle. The entire battle from the first torpedo to the final explosion lasted about 2 hours. And in that time, the largest and most powerful battleship in human history, a ship into which an entire empire had invested all its hopes, never managed to sink a single enemy vessel. If you like this story and want more content like this, give this video a like. Write in the comments which ship or piece of technology you would like to hear the next story about. And be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new episodes.